It is imperative that the Trail of Tears Association ensure that the record of what was done to the First Nations of the southeastern United States remains as relevant a story today as it was 180 years ago.
An amazing story that the people, the ancestors of the Eastern Band, purposefully enacted and saw their way all the way through all the suffering that it took to remain here.
The Cherokee wanted to communicate with themselves, but most importantly, they wanted to communicate with the world.
So ancestral Cherokee people are cosmopolitan people. They had deep and wide social networks.
One disillusioned soldier wrote that he was paid to commit a crime, to defend a fraudulent treaty with, in his words, the vilest machinations man or demon could invent.
And if you understand the Trail of Tears, and if you don't forget the Trail of Tears, when you go on to study just what happened in the 19th century after the Cherokee people got to their new homelands, picked themselves back up, and rebuilt a great society and a great democracy and a government built on the rule of law.
We don't do this to shame or blame. We do it because it's an opportunity for us to say to the world, our ancestors persevered. They had tenacity and resilience. They refused to be victims. They rebuilt the Cherokee Nation.
So I think that y'all should give yourselves a round of applause for all that you've accomplished in the last 25 years.
You didn't sign up to be warriors in this battle. Your efforts to speak plainly about the Trail of Tears, to preserve the history, helps push back on this nonsense. So we are bringing back the history course for the Cherokee people, by the Cherokee people, so that this generation of Cherokees coming up will know their own history.
I'm going to go ahead and get this thing started so we can keep on time. This is Dr. Christopher Haveman. He is the assistant professor at Western Alabama, and he is the author of Rivers of Sand, Creek Indian Immigration, Relocation, and Ethnic Cleansing in the American South, and Bending Their Way Onward, Creek Indian Removal in Documents. And Chris, I've known him for years, and he is one of the best Southeastern Indian scholars, and his specialty there is the Muscogee people, the different Creeks people in Alabama and Georgia before the removal, and he has just done groundbreaking work on the creek removal. And if you're interested in his books, they're right outside here, and there will be another talk a little bit later in case you see someone later, say go see Chris's talk. He'll be here twice. So I just want to welcome Chris Haveman.
Thank you, Sue. You flatter me. None of that's true. When I started researching the removal of the Muscogee people, I approached the topic with a simple question. How was the federal government able to move 23,000 people, 100s of whom did not want to leave the land of their ancestors, to present-day Oklahoma? How did that happen? And to begin to answer that question, you have to look at treaties. After the War of 1812, the federal government dispatched commissioners all through the eastern United States in an attempt to get these Indian nations to sign land cession treaties. And they used a number of tactics. They cajoled them, they coerced them, they threatened them in a number of cases, bullied them. In the case of the Creeks, and this happens in other parts of the eastern United States, they found someone who could be bought, someone who could be bribed. And this person was William McIntosh. And so the story of Muscogee removal really begins in 1825 with William McIntosh. McIntosh was from the Coweta town, and he had ceded land to the federal government on 2 prior occasions, in 1818 and 1821. After the 1821 session, after the 1818 and 1821 session, the National Council, the Creek governing body, passed a law that any land cession without the approval of the entire National Council, that person would be subject to death. And so William McIntosh knew the risks involved, but the federal government was offering him tens of thousands of dollars. And so they negotiated beginning in 1824, and in some cases they were negotiating in the woods in the middle of the night so that nobody would catch on what they were doing. And finally, in February of 1825, they presented the treaty to the rest of the Creek Nation, who really had no idea the scope of this treaty. And so what the Treaty of Indian Springs was a land cession treaty coupled with an emigration component to it, all right? So it's both an emigration treaty and it's a land cession treaty. There's not really anything unique about the Treaty of Indian Springs. Many different types of treaties, like the Treaty of Indian Springs, were signed throughout the eastern United States. Some were just land cession treaties with no immigration component, and some had the immigration component with it. It's just basically whatever the commissioners could get away with. All right, most Indian nations said, we do not want to leave the land of our ancestors, we will not leave. And so they didn't get that immigration component in. But William McIntosh, by all accounts, wanted to move to present-day Oklahoma. And so he had this immigration component added to it. These treaties were diabolical in the sense that they were not simply land cession treaties. They absolutely knew exactly what was going to happen with these land cession treaties. So let me explain what happens. In the Treaty of Indian Springs, they ceded all of the Creek's Georgia land and a large chunk of the Creek's Alabama land to the federal government. All right? Any Creek Indian or Muscogee person who wanted to leave could sign up, and the government would pay for their trip west, and they would pay for 1 year's worth of food until they can get their cropland up and running in present-day Oklahoma. Now, I'm going to fast forward really quickly. This treaty was illegal. The Creeks protested. 2 months later, they executed William McIntosh and a number of his co-conspirators. They burned their property, they destroyed their livestock, and this sent the McIntosh party scrambling to safety in Georgia and places like Montgomery, Alabama. The Muscogees then went on a very concerted anti-Indian Springs campaign to get this treaty overturned. And they were successful, despite the fact that the federal government was resolute in enforcing it. Georgia was threatening a civil war. In January of 1826, the Treaty of Washington was signed, which nullified the Treaty of Indian Springs, okay? But here's the deal. And I couple these two treaties together. We're fast forwarding through this because the Treaty of Washington was essentially just a watered down Treaty of Indian Springs. Georgia, threatening a civil war, got their land back. So Georgia, the Creeks lost all their land. The Muscogee peoples lost all their land in Georgia. The Alabama land was returned to the Muscogee Nation, to the Muscogee peoples. Okay, but it didn't really matter because the way the treaty was set up, it didn't matter how much land was given back to the Muscogees. The treaty was going to do its thing. And so let me explain why this treaty was set up the way it was and why these treaties were so diabolical. So by losing all of their Georgia land, the Muscogee peoples were forced out of Georgia in the year 1826. They had to be back in Alabama by calendar year January 1st, 1827, okay? Alabama, the Creek Nation in Alabama is not overwhelmingly fertile. There's strips of some thin black belt soil that's nice, but most of it is this red clay. It suffers from droughts. There's a series of droughts in the late 1820s and early 1830s. So all of the good arable land in the Muscogees controlled within the state of Alabama was already spoken for. Now you have about 8,000 Muscogee peoples who are forced into Alabama, and they're left scrambling to find good quality soil. They don't find it, all right? And so this begins a period of sort of transience. They're homeless, they're looking for land, they don't have any food. By the way, this treaty also erased all the Creeks, Georgia hunting land, okay? So very quickly you see food shortages. In 1828, a year after they're forced out of Georgia, you begin to see Muscogee peoples going to Fort Mitchell and asking for food. And so they bring out literally rotted flour with mold in it that the Creeks are willing to eat just because it's there and the government doesn't want it anymore. You see stories of them eating decaying animal carcasses that they would never touch in a million years under normal circumstances. But it shows you almost immediately the level of desperation within among the Muscogee peoples. Okay, and this is exactly how the treaty was supposed to work. You minimize their domain, you cram a bunch of people into a small space. Oh, by the way, there's one other thing. In Georgia, prior to 1825, the nearest white settlements were about 40 to 50 to 60 miles away. Okay? Traveling from Forsyth or Milledgeville or all these central Georgia cities is difficult, believe it or not. You know, they're on horseback and on wagon, but these were really dangerous with ruts and ravines they had to cross, and this was not easy travel. And so the number of whites traveling into the Creek Nation at this time, very limited. But once the Treaty of Indian Springs and the Treaty of Washington go into effect, they lose all that Georgia land. And within months after the Treaty of Washington, the city of Columbus, Georgia is platted right on the Chattahoochee River. So rather than traveling 50, 60 miles over very rough terrain, all they have to do is cross a bridge or go across in a ferry. And they're right in the heart of the lower Creek towns. And Columbus becomes a boom town almost overnight. You have gamblers, you have land speculators, you have whiskey peddlers, you have just ne'er-do-wells who come in who just want to cheat the Indians out of money, all right? And they're right on the doorstep of the Creek Nation, all right? And this is exactly what the treaty was designed to do. Put whites on the doorstep of these peoples, cheat them, steal their land, steal their wealth, whatever, all coupled with the starvation component of it. And then this is where the immigration aspect comes into this treaty, all right? Every time the Muscogee peoples complained to the federal government that whites were trespassing on their land, what did the federal government say? Immigrate, go to Indian territory. That's your salvation. And so this is how it worked diabolically, right? You make life miserable in the East, and you promise them salvation in the West, all right? The first McIntosh Party leaves in 1827, the fall of 1827. Most of these are friends, family members, business partners, hangers-on of William McIntosh. Not all, but some. In 1828, there's a second party that goes that are also kind of the remnants of this McIntosh party, all right? In 1829, a third voluntary immigrating party goes, made up of almost none of the McIntosh party. And this is by far the biggest party. So the first McIntosh party that left in 1827, 600 Muscogee peoples left, about 86 slaves went with them. The next party went about 500 total, slaves and Muscogee peoples. The 1829 party, with no McIntosh members, 1,300, all right? It shows you that very quickly on, Muscogee peoples who absolutely had no desire to leave the land of their birth were now saying, it's too hard here. We either starve to death here, you know, or we move west and try to make it go with it, all right? And so I'm just gonna really quickly, I gotta move over here for the pointer, but, so, and I have some maps because a lot of people are interested in just the routes and sort of some of the experiences. This is from the second immigrating party. They congregated, so there were camps all throughout here. Fort Bainbridge was one of the camps I identified. These were sort of the, you know, nearby camps that they would set up and you could put your stuff in a wagon and whatnot. And they would all consolidate here at Fort Strother, a First Creek War fort. And the first party in 1827, they met in Harpersville, which is just outside of present-day Birmingham, but they followed the same route. They went up to Tuscumbia here. This one does a little different. They go up to current Guntersville, Alabama, but back then Gunter's Landing. They hugged the Tennessee River. Some went in boats. The women, children, elderly who couldn't walk went in boats. and then they marched over here. This is pretty rough, not really any good roads, this area right here. The first McIntosh party just absolutely is just mired in the muck. It's just raining every single day. The water party goes up here through the Tennessee River, catches the Ohio briefly, and then down the Mississippi. They all meet in Memphis. This is a very swampy area. If you've ever flown into Memphis, it's still, during the rainy season, it's still inundated with water. The men never wanted to leave their horses or their property, so they always accompanied the wagons. And so you had a whole bunch of people walking through this, during the high times, water's up to your chest, sometimes up to a horse's back. It's just inundated with water. The women and children continued on down the Mississippi River, and then they go up the Arkansas River. Sometimes they meet in Little Rock. This one bypasses Little Rock and continues on. So basically the first and the second and the third follow this exact same path right here, and then they end up here at near Fort Gibson, and this is the Creek territory, the Muscogee territory right there. So while these immigrating parties are going west, there's like I said, 99 100s of the Creek people are trying to make a go of it in the Creek Nation, all right? But this is getting increasingly difficult as more and more whites stream in. I saw in 1830 they did sort of an informal census of the number of white families living in the Creek Nation. It came out to 25,000. So in 1830 there were 25,000 whites living in the Creek Nation. At the time, probably 21,000 Creek Indians. So whites outnumbered the number of Creeks in the Creek Nation, okay? I argue in all my research that this was ethnic cleansing. It wasn't, we're trying to use a removal just as almost too sanitized. I use immigration for Creeks who went voluntarily, and you see the voluntary up here in quotations. Some did go voluntarily. William McIntosh, by all accounts, was very excited to go to Indian Territory. My hypothesis is that he wanted to become the principal chief of the Muscogee Peoples. He was the 5th ranking chief in the National Council, and I think this was a political move. I think he said, if I'm the first headman, he saw writing on the wall. William McIntosh knew that at one point the federal government was going to move everybody to the west. And I think he said, if I'm the first one there, the first National Council member there, I will be the principal headman of all the Creek Nation. And I think that's absolutely what his plan was, okay? So he wanted to go. His brother didn't want to go, Rollie McIntosh, who actually led the McIntosh Party west after William McIntosh was executed. His brother, half-brother, leads. And his half-brother is very candid when one of the commissioners asked him if he wants to go. This is when they're negotiating the Treaty of Indian Springs in 1824-25. And Rollie McIntosh, his half-brother to William, says, no, we went there hunting. We go there hunting once in a while. The mosquitoes are terrible. The horseflies are huge. There's no water out there. There's no forest. We don't want to go out there. But of course, he's now a dutiful soldier in this emigration drama, right? And now Rollie, quite frankly, has designs on becoming the principal headman in the West. And the best evidence for this is exactly what happened. When Rollie McIntosh moves west, he becomes the principal headman of the Muscogee Nation. And he holds on to this position from 1825 until 1827, when they actually remove it, until 1859, about when he retires, all right? And we'll talk about this, but even when the large detachments go in 1836, when the real headmen of the Eastern Creek Nation begin moving, they're subservient to Rollie McIntosh in the West, all right? And this plays out again in the Civil War when the McIntosh faction takes out their vengeance on those who had a role in executing William decades earlier, okay? So I mentioned voluntary quotes because some did want to go, but absolutely a lot of them said, the whites are never going to stop. We might as well go and get the best piece of land while we can. Some of them, it's a real heartbreaking letter, but they wrote and they said, we're not going for us. We're going for our children. They want to hunt, they need to hunt, and there's no more game here in Alabama and Georgia. So they're going west for the next generation. So it's really heartbreaking. So it's voluntary sort of in a sense, right? Some went eagerly, most of them went reluctantly, okay? The Treaty of, and I'm just going to talk about the Treaty of Washington now because that nullifies the Treaty of Indian Springs. But the Treaty of Washington is working as designed. Life in the Creek Nation every single year gets exponentially worse. But the government is frustrated because not as many Muscogee peoples left by 1830 as they had planned on. They anticipated tens of thousands of going in the first few waves. So 1827, 28, they figured 10,000 at least would go, 15,000 perhaps. But by the time 1830 rolls around, you only have about 3,500 people who have left. And so Andrew Jackson, who's now president, starts to kind of turn the screws, I guess, and he cancels all federally funded voluntary immigrations. Many Muscogee peoples had planned on moving west. Some, you got to take the agents' estimates with a grain of salt because they're trying to please the government, right? They don't want to get fired. And so I've heard up to 2,000 people preparing to leave in 1830. How many, I don't know, but these people had not planted any corn. A lot of them had packed their stuff into wagons in anticipation of leaving. They were going to get fed by the federal government in the West, so they had no need to plant. And then Jackson pulls the rug out from under them. There's going to be no more federally sponsored immigrations. You can go west if you want, but you've got to pay your way, okay? Which is no small feat back then, right? Steamboats and all that stuff, very expensive. And so now you add to the numbers of homeless, starving Creek Indians. If there were 2,000 people, this is not a small number of people who are added to the growing list of starving, okay? This causes some problems in the Creek Nation. It's coupled by 1830-31, there's a severe drought, and so a lot of crops are failing. So even Creeks who have land, who have been in Alabama, the upper Creeks their entire life, crops are failing, and so they're having trouble there. So starvation exponentially increases. Alcoholism is rampant. You have whiskey peddlers who are selling whiskey to the Muscogee peoples on credit, right? They want to get the person indebted to them. And so that's another problem that you see. There's only half-hearted efforts to really get the whites out. They do send in marshals to arrest people who are illegally squatting in Creek land, but again, 25,000, there's no way they can even make a dent in this, all right? 1832 rolls around. Between 1830 and 1832, they have made numerous trips to Washington, D.C. to protest this. They're protesting the deteriorating conditions. They're mostly protesting whites. One of the when we think about removal, we tend to think, at least for the Creek perspective, we think about treaties and we think about the Second Creek War, but white squatters were the pestilence that really drove out the Creek Indians, and they absolutely drove the Muskogee peoples nuts because they were squatting illegally. They were sometimes killing the Indian family and stealing their house and their crops, and this was rampant. And so they went to Washington, D.C., demanding that these people be forced out of their land. And again, every time they went to Andrew Jackson, they said, go west. We've given you your salvation in Indian territory. You must go there. And so they get really, really frustrated. Meanwhile, the federal government's getting frustrated as well because, again, by 1832, only about 3,500 people have left. And so they really want to start ramping this up. And so the government brings out another treaty in their arsenal. And again, this treaty is not much different than a lot of other treaties that are signed in the eastern United States. And this is the treaty. So one thing I'll mention too, because people are interested, the 1834 immigration is really voluntary immigration. So there's two Macintosh immigrations, 1827, 28. Did I mention that third, 1829? When they signed the Treaty of Washington in 1832, which I'll get to in a second. Two more emigrations go. And they kind of follow the same path here. This one, well, let me talk about the Treaty of Washington really quickly first. Let me do that. So the Treaty of Washington, essentially, the Creeks are so frustrated, they're so desperate, that the federal government approaches them with this plan. They say, look, you cede the rest of your land to the federal government, and in exchange, each head of family, each family, nuclear family, will get 320 acres of land with a title that you can sell or you can keep, whatever you want to do, okay? This was a terrible, terrible treaty for the Muscogee peoples. The only explanation I can come up with, and I'll explain more about what it does in a sec, the only explanation I can come up with is that the Creeks had been, the Muscogee Peoples, had been so browbeaten by the federal government. Whites illegally squatting on their land, the federal government does nothing. Whites trespass as if it's their piece of property. But whites honor something on paper. If you have a deed or a title to a piece of land, whites really take that seriously, right? And so the Creeks, I think, said, we've been here for eons, but they don't respect that. Maybe if we get a deed or a title to our land, then they'll respect that. That's the only thing I can come up with. Because what happens is they cede the final 5 million acres of their land to the federal government. Each family takes 320 acres, which is a mile by a half-mile rectangle. Headmen get a mile by a mile square, so they're called mile chiefs, or 640 acres. But when you add up every single section and half section, it only comes up to about 2.1 million acres. In other words, well over half of all the land ceded to the federal government will now go up for auction for white purchase. And so this is a map of Chambers County, Chambers and Tallapoosa. You can see Tallapoosa. There's Tallapoosa, and here's Chambers County. These are all the reserves. So these are all the reserves of the Creek families. All this white here, and this is just the lower creeks. There's a whole bunch of squares over here for the upper creeks. Every one that does not have a letter in it is open for white purchase, all right? So think about this. The Creeks were complaining that they were being surrounded by whites who were illegally trespassing on their land. This now legalizes it, right? Whites who purchase this plot of land right here is not squatting anymore. He has legal title to that piece of land, right? So the Creeks, they've been fighting this for years, and now they've legalized it. This is Russell County and Macon County, right? And you see all these vast swaths. These are all miles, so you can count a mile. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 miles right there. This is all open to whites, so whites are going to be scattered all throughout the Creek territory, all right? And then to make matters worse, this 1832 Treaty of Washington, which the Creeks were not browbeaten into, this was an absolute mark of desperation. What it does is, remember William McIntosh, right? He was forbidden from ceding land to the federal government, and he was executed as a result, right? They passed a law that anyone who cedes land without the approval of the National Council will be executed. And William McIntosh was executed 2 months later. Now, what this does, by ceding it all to the federal government, this becomes the state of Alabama. These Muscogee families are promised citizenship in some future world, but in reality, they're not ever going to be treated as equals, right? There's no more Creek government, there's no more National Council, and any individual family can sell their land without repercussions, because the National Council does not have any control over them. And so what you begin seeing after the 1832 Treaty of Washington is the literal disintegration of the Creek Nation, all right? The National Council was a united front against the cession of any more land. And people realized, look, don't do it, because look what happened to William McIntosh. But now you have families that can sell land for a profit without any repercussions. And many, many, many sell their land because they're starving. And so many sell their land because they need food to survive. Others come in and they cheat them. The whites cheat them out of their land. Let's see here. Okay, so here's Columbus too. So this is where Columbus is right here. You can see how close it is, right, to all these Creek families right here. Whiskey traders, land speculators flood the Creek Nation. In all sorts of diabolical ways do they cheat the Muscogee peoples out of land. Some pretend they're lawyers, and they say, hey, here's a contract. I'll work for you, and I'll protect your land. And they sign away the rights to the land, all right? Plying with alcohol. Intoxicated people will sign anything, okay? Impersonation, right? In an era before ID cards, right? You can just say, hey, this is my, you find some person who's literally starving to death, you bribe them with some bacon, some flour, and to keep them alive. You say, you go over to this commission here, you say that this is your land. And the land may sell for $1,000, and you give it to the person, and then that white person takes $990 back. And so he got a $1,000 piece of land for $10, all right? A lot of times the real owner of the land wants to sell the land because he's starving, and they'll sell it for $1,000, and then the minute the commissioner, there's always a white person there to kind of make sure there's no cheating going on, which is laughable because there was massive amounts of cheating going on. The minute the white person leaves, I've seen one where they actually are choking, they're literally choking the guy to give up the money back. And so the guy will get the land for free, all right? It's so sad, but it would be comical if it wasn't so sad, is this is a very powerful Tuckabatchee headman that sells his land for $1,200, $1,300, which is a pretty good sum at the time. And the minute the commissioners leave, the white person, for some reason, wants to hug the headman. And so they hug, and while he hugs, he reaches back in his pouch and pulls out the money, all right? And so we could be here all day talking about all the different ways that they cheated the Indians out of their land. It's horrible, it's absolutely terrible, and it just makes everything worse, starvation's worse. And now you have people who are enraged. I mentioned this before, so I'll go back to it. When the Treaty of Washington signed, the federal government said, okay, we'll open up voluntary immigration again, all right? They're hoping that all these Indians who are getting cheated out of their land will now move west. This is the 1834 Voluntary Party, and I mention this only because this was an absolute mess. Jackson said, I don't want any immigrating party to leave until they have 2,000 people in the camps ready to go. Well, this is how absolutely the Creeks wanted to be on their land so much that even with all these problems going on in the Creek Nation, the Muscogee Nation, they still wanted to stay on their land. So that only about 500-600 people actually signed up for this immigration. This was in the summer. And Jackson kept postponing it. And finally they said, look, we either have to cancel the thing or we have to send them on their way. And so they don't leave until December, all right? And so they leave, and the entire way it's snowing, hailing, or raining in cold temperatures. They start here in Centerville, they go through Tuscaloosa, Columbus, Mississippi, up through here. It gets so bad that they have to put women and children in steamboats. And so notice there's no steamboat here on the Tennessee River. They go down the Mississippi, or the Mississippi River, and then up the Arkansas. The Arkansas is actually frozen solid. They actually, near Little Rock, they're about, I don't know how many, a few dozen miles away south of Little Rock. They actually get out and start cutting down trees on the bank of the river, hoping that the impact will break up the ice. They ran the steamboat into the ice, trying to break up the ice. And they finally make it to Little Rock, and then they have to abandon it because the rest of the river is completely frozen solid. And so they march through, along the north bank of the Arkansas, through snow and hail. It's freezing temperatures in the 30s. There's an influenza pandemic going on in Arkansas, and so they're just, these people do not have time to camp. They're just racing through. And the military captain in charge of this party, he's a captain in the U.S. Army, he talks about the women and children crying constantly. All you hear is crying because of the physical pain, but also the emotional pain. None of these people would have left the Creek Nation if not for the Treaty of Indian Springs, the Treaty of Washington, and the Second Treaty of Washington in 1832. Life was that unbearable, all right? There's one in 1835 that it also leaves in the winter. They don't learn their lesson. They postpone it until the next December and they leave. This one, they go through a lot of problems, but there's not much suffering, quote, suffering by, at least according to the letters that they give. Okay, so life in the Creek Nation is unbearable, and now you have this rage component added in because the cheating of the Creeks out of their land cession, the diabolical ways in which land is falling into the hands of whites without proper compensation to the Creek family is going to cause a war, all right? And so the Second Creek War breaks out in May of 1836, and it's the cause of it is there's a number of causes. Immigration was one of the causes. That's sort of the elephant in the room. The last decade, the federal government has been cajoling and coercing the Creeks into moving west. And every single time, a majority of the people say, we do not want to go. Stop asking us. Even as life gets worse, they still say no. So they're enraged by this sort of policy of moving Creeks to the west, all right? But the proximal cause of the war was the 1832 Treaty of Washington and the cheating of these Creek families out of their land, all right? The war rages from May to July 1836. Then the federal government says, oh, we defeated them all. They did. We'll come back to that in a second. They just thought they did. So the war goes into this little lull. Meanwhile, anybody that's a co-conspirator in the Creek War, they forcibly remove. So I call the period of emigration where they voluntarily, in quotes, left between 1827 and 1835. In 1836, we call this forced removal. People in shackles. So a lot of them are here. They're encamped at Fort Mitchell, some at Tuskegee, and they're literally shackled, manacles in the arms, in the legs, with a chain running between them in groups of 300 in some cases, and they're marching like this, 90 miles from Fort Mitchell to Montgomery. In the back, wagon loads of wives and children crying, all right? Wailing, in fact, they don't say crying, they say wailing, all right? They go to Montgomery, they take steamboats down the Alabama River here, they end up in Mobile, and then they go across here. There's some evidence that on this particular voyage, they went outside the Keys, these barrier islands off the coast of Mississippi. They go to New Orleans, excuse me, up the Mississippi River, and then they end up here at Rock Row. There's some evidence that there's an escape plot on the Mississippi River, or on the Alabama River in the middle of the night. There's some of the military personnel who are accompanying these Creeks on the steamboat. Excuse me. They get wind that there's a plot for them to jump overboard, essentially, or commandeer the steamboat. And so they train their guns on them. And one of the agents who's writing this in a letter says, the Creeks stopped when all of our guns were trained on them. Basically, they realized the gig is up. After this one incident, it appears that everything kind of goes according to the government's plan, and so much so that they unshackle the prisoners. And so by the time they reach New Orleans, they're not shackled at all. They're free to run around. And in fact, they go up, there's one incident where they stop at Natchez in Mississippi for some wood. These steamboats run on wood, and so for the boilers. And they let the people run around. And then when the bell rings, they come back to the steamboat, okay? There's kind of a humorous thing that happens up here at Rock Row. They get to Rock Row, and they're going to camp here for several days while they make preparations, because the river's too low on the Arkansas to go by steamboat, so they're going to have to march it. So they have to get these wagons at the last minute. So they're there for several days and days and days and days, and they're all camped, they're unshackled. Meanwhile, all the stuff is brought off the steamboat, because these were not government steamboats. These were just private steamboats. And so whoever owned the steamboat had to go up to St. Louis or down back to New Orleans. So they had to unpack everything in these camps. Well, meanwhile, the shackles are brought onto the shore, and they can see them because they're in these big hogshead barrels, but they didn't have heads on them, so you could just look inside and see the shackles. And they woke up one morning, and the barrel's gone. The Creeks had rolled them, the Muscogee, actually the Uchis, who are not Muscogean speakers, they rolled them into the river in the middle of the night. They were sunk, and they were lost forever, the guy said, right? They march across. It's hotter than blue blazes going across here. 90-some degrees, water is low, and they're just marching. There's a second, so this is July of 1836, there's a second party of Creek prisoners that leaves in August of 1836. Only about, here there's 2,400 people. 200 people go in 1836. These are mostly just the wives and children who were left behind. And they follow the exact same route. Okay, and they end up in Fort Gibson by September-ish of 1836. Meanwhile, the federal government demands that all Creek peoples leave the Creek Nation. Okay, even those who, not only those who did not participate in the Second Creek War, but even those who helped the federal government defeat the Creeks in the Second Creek War. All right? And this is where I get into the idea that this is ethnic cleansing. This was not removal, this was ethnic cleansing. because the federal government wanted every single Muscogee person out of Alabama. Every single one. There were Muskogees who lived like white planters. They had big houses, they had a lot of land, they had African-American slaves working their fields. They contributed to the tax base, and if you went up to them and met them, you would not even know that they were a Muscogee person. They had to go to. The federal government in the 1820s and early 1830s even went to try to convince Indian countrymen, these are white men married to Creek women, they wanted them to go to Indian territory as well. They said, if we can convince the white husbands to go west, then their wives and all their relatives, cousins and uncles and everybody else will go with them. It didn't work, but again, it just shows you that they're not saying, look, we just want some of you to go. They wanted every last one to go. So this was absolutely ethnic cleansing. So they order all these other people in, about 16,000 people, to go. And they encamp them at various places in the former Creek Nation. There's a camp at Tallahassee, there's a camp at Wetumpka, there's two at Talladega, one in Chambers County here. This is the primary one. This is the first one, Apostol Holo, who's probably the most prominent headman in the Creek Nation throughout the removal era. He's stationed at Tallahassee. This is Detachment 1, and he's going to be the lead guy because he has all these people, thousands of people, in fact, who want to follow in his footsteps. And so they march, and then you can see here that this is the route they do. They march up, again, they're all following the same route through Tuscumbia up to Memphis. Here you can see this is a busy map, but you can kind of see the water route here. The women and elderly men go, because the swamp during this time is so bad. In fact, one U.S. Army officer goes through the Mississippi swamp right here on the west side of Memphis, and he goes, and the water is up. He's riding on a saddle. The water's up to his seat. It's up to a horse's back. So you see the horse's head, and basically he's riding through the water. You do see several hundred Muscogee peoples, go through the Mississippi swamp here. And by the way, they stop here for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. Meanwhile, the people who had taken steamboats, the vast majority of them took steamboats because they wanted to bypass this. They told these men, hey, we'll meet you in Little Rock in 2 weeks. 2 weeks come, they're not there. 3 weeks come, they're not there. 4 weeks. And they actually have to ride back. When I mentioned the guy who was riding through the swamp on horseback, he went on a steamboat. He had to go back to check on what's going on with these people. And you know what he finds? They're not in any hurry. They're sitting around, they're hunting, they're camping, they're stalling their movements. They don't want to get to Indian territory. And by the way, there are almost no white people living in this area. None. And they feel free. They're free from white involvement. And that's what the guy said. And surely that happened. But the Creek story, there's a massive amount of resistance. The Creeks employed a number of resistance strategies to sort of stall their movements is one example. Another example is if they wanted a day off, they would simply stop. And what could the Army do? There was one Army commander in charge of 2,000 people. They would hire a handful of local white people from Alabama to help out. Okay? So you may have maybe 8 to 10 white people trying to control 2,500 Muscogee peoples. And so there was a number of occasions where the headman tells the commander, we're going to rest here for a day. And the commander says, nope, you can't. You got to keep moving. There's no water here. There's nothing. Blah. And the guy goes, we're going to stop here. And they go in and they start throwing their stuff out of the wagon. And the Army captain, so when it comes to the removal story, the Creek removal, the Muscogee removal story, don't think of it as, white Army captains poking, trudging people through swamps and beating them if they're not marching. It's the other way around. It's U.S. Army captains pleading with the headman, please go 10 miles more, please. They are begging the headman, please listen to me. And they're at their wits' end. They have to keep a journal, and they're just saying, I'm losing it. I mean, some guy goes, I'm in despair because he can't get the people to do what he wants them to do. I have this map here, or this intended route. This is one of the biggest acts of resistance they commit. So Apocalaholo, the most powerful headman in the Creek Nation, leaves from Tallahassee, goes through Centerville, Tuscaloosa. It's here that his party is supposed to go through Mississippi, all right? There's another party that's gonna go up through Russellville here, okay? And when the Muscogee people realize that the party's gonna split and the people are not gonna follow in Apocalaholo's path, they stop. And they begin throwing their stuff out of the wagon. And the army captain, he's a lieutenant, he says, you have to go, you can't have 4,000 people going on the same road, there's not enough provisions. And they said, we were told we had to follow in his footsteps, and we'd rather starve than disobey him. And he writes in his letter, what can I do? I can't control 2,000 people. So guess what? They had to make it work. So I didn't mention this, it's not terribly important to the story, but the U.S. Army the government had contracted with a private firm, a bunch of money-making locals, to move the Indians at $28.50 per person. They thought that this was going to be a big profitable thing. Turns out to be a massive money loser for them. And one of the reasons it's a big money loser is because of this. In theory, they would have had these depots. These depots never materialized, by the way, but they said that these little food depots along the way, and so you have one party go up here and one party go up here, etc. But when they stopped and said, we're going to go in the same path as Apocalaholo, they suddenly had to scramble to find enough provisions for that route, for two parties to go through. And it cost them massive amounts of money. Because they were buying corn and other things from farmers from along, now that they have to truck it in, but these farmers are not dumb. They're saying, you want my corn, you're gonna have to pay a premium for it. And I know this because years after removal ends, you can see in the National Archives all these petitions from these contractors for money lost. They're trying to recoup the money. They're saying that we promised $28.50, but we had these routes settled. You owe us, the federal government, for this because it's not our fault that the Indians didn't want to do what we told them to do, okay? So 5 detachments leave through here, 1 detachment stays behind. This is detachment 6 because the government had the gall to ask the Creek Indians to help fight in Florida against the Seminoles. And some Creeks said yes. And they got what a white person was paid. So that mounted men got what a mounted U.S. Army person got, and the infantry got so they drove a hard bargain. So for the next year almost, they're in Florida fighting the Seminoles, and then finally, and again, this is another incident where you see broken promises by the federal government, because one of the stipulations to fight in Florida against the Seminoles was that they would be moved back. So this is August of 1836. The Creeks the Muscogee People told the federal government, we need to be in Oklahoma, present-day Oklahoma, by February of 1837. So we have time to clear fields and plant crops in that spring. Federal government says, fine. February rolls around, they don't get discharged. All spring, all summer, it's not until October of 1837 that they're finally discharged. Right? So 6 months after they were promised, 8 months after they were promised to be relieved. And then again, another broken promise, another stipulation was that their family members and children would be allowed to stay in East Alabama while they are on their tour of duty. But then you have white militias from Georgia, Russell County, Alabama, all these places. They see 4,000 or 2,000, 3,000 Creek Indians encamped, and they say, we got to get rid of these people. Meanwhile, the Second Creek War, which the federal government thought was done in July of 1836, starts. There's more fighting beginning. Turns out the war wasn't done. The people who had fought the war just were hiding out in the swamps. And so the federal government moves them down to Mobile Point, which is Fort Morgan, right on the beach now, in defiance of what the Creeks had been promised. There they die, hundreds of them, probably up to 450 of them die of yellow fever. They're moved from Mobile Point right here to Pass Christian, where it's a little, Pass Christian, by the way, is sort of the summer retreat for New Orleans residents during the sickly season, so it's a nice place. And then finally in October, the Creeks from Tampa, who are fighting the Seminoles, finally meet up with them in Pass Christian. They then go to New Orleans where they're camped. 9 steamboats, about 7 to 9, depending on which letter you believe. And they all go up in a caravan up the Mississippi River. And literally on almost the first or second night, right off the coast of Baton Rouge, a steamboat collides with a descending steamboat in the middle of the night. Between 290 and 310 Creeks drown in the middle of the night. So this is like the final insult to the removal story. These people end up in Fort Gibson in December of 1837. And meanwhile, and then again, I'll just finish up with this before I take a few questions. It's ethnic cleansing, right? There are Muscogee peoples who had fled to the Chickasaws in Mississippi, and there are Muscogee peoples who had fled to the Cherokees in North Carolina and Tennessee. Oh, by the way, a lot of them were still with the Seminoles. Some of them had moved to live with the Seminoles. You see agents go in to North Carolina, Tennessee to try to round up every Creek Indian they can find, Muscogee person they can find. They go to the same thing among the Chickasaws to round up every last one they can find. You have a party of 300 that leaves Mississippi, follows kind of basically the route up here to Memphis, and then down, and they walk the rest of the way. I think I have the last one here. So here, this is the last, amongst the creeks they go up to here, Ross's Landing, Chattanooga, they go down the Tennessee River, and it's entirely by river. No, these are people who will escape. In fact, they did escape. So I have Decatur and Browns Ferry, Diddle's Landing. These are mentioned because a storm hits in Alabama, and it gets really rainy, really windy, and so they're in these keelboats and flatboats, like just big wooden barges. They have to land because it's too choppy. The Tennessee River, by the way, is not it's a big river, it's a beautiful river, but it's not a very good river to navigate. A lot of shoaling, a lot of shallow areas. So they can't do this at night when there's a lot of big current because they don't want to get beached. So they stop on the side, and what happens? A dozen escape. Then they try to find them, they can't. They go down here to Browns Ferry, 70 more escape. They only, about 50 to 70 escape, and they're never heard from again. All right, so again, a lot of defiance during the removal story. And then they end up back here at Fort Gibson in May and June of 1837, all right? And then one final thing I'll say, when people are always interested in the fatality rate, there was this myth that the deaths along the journey were massive, and that's not, by today's standards, they were massive. I mean, anytime you have a dozen or more, if we all took a trip to Oklahoma and 36 of us died, that's a huge deal. But in terms of the 1800s, where death was just omnipresent, not terrible. What was terrible was the first year of resettlement. And if you compare the voluntary period, all the Muscogee peoples who were moved between 1837 and 1835, it's about 30 to 33% mortality rate within the first calendar year. The forced removals from 1836 to 1837, just about the same, 27 to 33%. So 1/3 of the entire population of the Muscogee people were dead within 1 calendar year because of disease in Indian Territory. And so that's a massive tragedy, all right? And so we talk about this being ethnic cleansing, and it certainly was, but when it comes to the role of disease, it was almost, genocidal, right? The amount of death that happened in this sense, all right? Thank you very much.